Okay, thank you, Sinclair. So hopefully everybody, and there will be preference will be given to those questions coming up and voted for within Slido. So please do use that as to make sure you get the question asked. We're about to kick off on our first session now, entitled "Is there a science solution to bovine TB?" And obviously, in a room like this, I have to work on the basis there's a science solution to everything, including bovine TB. We are going to hear this morning from our own Dr. Andrew Byrne, but I'd like to invite Simon to kick off. Simon, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much. My presentation today is focusing on the decision by the Irish Government to essentially have an aim of eradicating bovine TB, BTB, by 2030. And these are my personal reflections. They don't necessarily reflect those of the Irish Government, although certainly there's a lot of detailed discussion on all of these issues. So in terms of my background, just to give you a very brief background, the first thing is that I work on the science side of the science policy interface. So all of my work and the work of my colleagues is seeking to provide objective information to support policy decision making by the national government, the Irish Government, by Animal Health Ireland and by other groups. And so I'm the director of the Centre for Veterinary Epi and Risk Analysis at UCD. And as I mentioned, the focus is particularly with respect to those two organisations. In terms of TB, I'm from Australia and I was involved in the very tail end of the successful eradication program in Australia, where the last case of bovine TB was in 2002. Obviously I work here, but also work closely with colleagues in lots of other countries, highlighted there in red. And I think one of the key lessons that I would have, and I think Andrew and colleagues would agree, is there's much to learn from the experiences of other countries. So in terms of TB research in Ireland, we've essentially been driven by two fundamental questions. And the first question is, TB will only be possible, TB eradication will only be possible if we have a good understanding of what we describe as the overall epidemiological system. So we really need to know what species are infected, what role do those species play, how infection is transmitted, how it's maintained, what are the main constraints to eradication, how important are they, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of current and proposed control strategies, and what would be the impact if those control strategies were put in place. So that's the first fundamental question that we've been looking at for a long period of time. And the second one is, eradication will only be possible if we're able to adequately control all of the factors that facilitate maintenance and ongoing spread of infection in this overall system. So that's essentially been our work for a long period of time, and many countries are focused on the same issue, but in a different context. So our context is clearly with respect to the Republic of Ireland. And this is a baseline information that we were clear about some years ago, and that is that we're working with a multi-host system. We know that there is maintenance of infection, cattle to cattle, but we also know that wildlife play a role. And the wildlife don't just maintain infection, that is, wildlife on their own would maintain infection with this organism, but there is spillback from wildlife to cattle. And the wildlife species of concern is badgers, but we do have concerns about deer in particular regional areas as well. And this really is not a surprise, because if you look around the world, wildlife play an important role. So in terms of the species that are named there, the possum, that's the Australian brush-tailed possum, it maintains infection in New Zealand. It never did in Australia. The badger in this part of the world, and certainly into France as well. The buffalo and feral pigs played a special role in Australia. White-tailed deer in North America, and wild boar are increasingly important in Spain and into France. But the most difficult issue for TB, and this, the situation in Ireland pales into insignificance in comparison, is in Kruger National Park. And that photo is of a lion with terminal TB. And the maintenance hosts, there's at least 3, and there's lots of spillover hosts. So it's a very complex system and extremely difficult to manage. So what are the challenges? What are the challenges that we face in the south? I would suggest that there are fundamentally 3. The first one is we need to identify ways to limit and hopefully prevent transmission of infection from wildlife to cattle. Secondly, the cattle story is also extremely challenging. Clearing infected herds is difficult. It is very hard to identify all infected animals, and residual infection, we call it residual infection, animals that are infected that we can't detect are increasingly problematic, and as part of that, limiting transmission from herd to herd. And then the third issue that we face in the south relates, in my view, relates to program governance, to do with management and cost sharing. And I'd like to go through each of those in turn a little bit later in the talk. I would suggest until 6 months ago that eradication in Ireland is wishful thinking. The graph looks great, and the graph in green refers to the Republic. For interest, the light blue line refers to Northern Ireland, and that's up to 2015. And this is based on work by colleagues from all of those 5 countries working together and getting common statistics that we could compare. But in discussions that I've had, particularly with policy colleagues in Brussels, even though that looks good, we actually do not or did not have the tools to eradicate. We can certainly continue to drive infection down, but for reasons that I'll explain, we didn't have the tools to eradicate. So what do we need to do? What are the, in terms of those 3 challenges, in terms of wildlife, if we're interested in limiting or preventing the drift or the transmission of infection from wildlife to cattle, we actually only have 3 options on the table. One is limiting contact, either through culling or through improved biosecurity, or dampening infection, particularly in wildlife populations, through vaccination. And certainly our perspectives in the Republic, culling is helpful, but for us to be effective in completely eliminating transmission, the culling pressure would need to be enormous. And there's societal and ethical issues, of course, associated with that. In terms of biosecurity, biosecurity is problematic. It's much easier with diseases like BVD. It is much, much harder with TB. And vaccination, I'll come back to in a moment. In terms of cattle, in terms of those sort of challenges, and these really have emerged as really difficult challenges for us in the Republic, the problems we've got is that all of the diagnostic tests are imperfect. Some of them are very good, but none of them is perfect. In fact, probably there's no diagnostic tests that are. And secondly, we have this ongoing, very substantial movement of stock. And again, I'll come back to these issues a little bit later. Now, what I'd like to do is to introduce one concept from my field, because it's important in the argument that I want to put forward. And it's known as the basic reproductive ratio. And I'd like to think, if you don't mind, of the common cold in people. I'm going to use this with TB, but the common cold in people. If we have an individual that comes into a group of people, and that individual, purple, that individual is infected, while that individual is infectious, 2 other people are infected. And while those 2 are infected, another 4 become infected. And we have what's known as a basic reproductive ratio of 2. And what we mean by that is that there's 2 secondaries for every primary, secondary generation for every primary, and 2 tertiaries for every secondary. So we have basically these layers of infection, first generation through to second generation through to third. And that's important because if we're trying to eradicate a disease, we're actually trying to drive the reproductive ratio below 1. If you look at the red line, the reproductive ratio is 2, and that results over time in exponential increase. And there's lots of assumptions, but that's what it means. If we look at the green line, the reproductive ratio is 1, which means that infection, basically, you have a similar number of cases over time, and the blue is successful eradication, where we have this concept of the basic reproductive rate, or ratio, below 1. Work that has very recently been completed by a PhD student in Ireland, and I should state that this work has not yet been published, so of course we need to treat it with care, would suggest that at the moment in the Republic of Ireland, the basic reproductive ratio of the whole system, badgers, deer, cattle, or badgers and cattle at least, is more than 1, which means that eradication is not possible. And that would confirm what we had thought. And that relates to all of the current controls. And I know that the controls here are different, but that would include, for example, badger culling. With all of those things, the basic reproductive ratio is greater than 1. So that's a problem. That's a big problem because we can continue to put more pressure on the system, but we've got a problem in terms of eradication. Now, what's happened in the last 6 months has been incredibly important and I believe groundbreaking for us, and I suspect for others as well, in that we've made a substantial advance. And the substantial advance has been that with the introduction of badger vaccination, and we now have the results of a large multi-year study in County Kilkenny, in the west of County Kilkenny, which has shown that if you, and this is based on theoretical grounds, but based on sound evidence that we've identified from that trial, that if you, on top of everything that we currently do, if we introduce badger vaccination as well, we can actually drive that reproductive ratio below 1. And so, for the first time ever, we really genuinely have the tools to eradicate. But there's a but. And the but is this, if I just explain. I think we're at a critical point in the Republic at the moment, and it's been interesting as this progressively unfolds. But there's a but, and the but is this. At the moment, if you introduce badger vaccination, we drive that reproductive ratio below 1, but not very much. And so therefore, what that means is if it's just below 1, it will probably take about 70 years. This is theoretical, but it gives an idea. It will take many decades to move to eradication. So even though we'll do it, we have the potential to do it, it's going to take a long time. So the concept that I'm suggesting, and that's currently being discussed, is for us to genuinely move to eradication, we need to drive the reproductive ratio even lower. And there's really only 2 options. One is essentially further, more intensive culling pressure on badgers and potentially on other wildlife species, or greater cattle controls. And the former really is not possible. So we're really looking at the latter. And I'd like to talk that through a little bit further. But just to show you in practical terms, I think colleagues spoke, the UFU President Barclay spoke previously about BVD eradication. We've recently finished work with German colleagues on modelling the BVD program in the south, and this is highly relevant, I think, to the north as well. And that is, what we've found is that decisions made now have huge implications into the future. And let me explain. So what we've got on the, I can't point at 4 screens at once, so I'll just point to this one here. What we've got is, on this axis here, is the number of PI animals, for those of you familiar with BVD, or the number, I guess, of infected farms. It's not quite the same. And this is over time. And if you notice there, this line here, the orange line, the level of PI retention that was occurring in Ireland during the first 2 to 3 years of the eradication program from 2013, if that had continued, essentially we would never eradicate BVD. This is the number of PIs. It's on a logarithmic scale. That's 10,000, that's 1,000, that's 100, and that's 10. But essentially we would never eradicate. But if we could turn around, as indeed has happened, if we could turn around the PI story, and this work was undertaken in 2016, so if we could turn around that PI story retention and resolve PI retention, then essentially we could eradicate about 4 years later, 4 to 5 years later, than what we would have done if there'd never been any PI retention in the first place. And that graph, which was nicknamed the snazzy graph, turned the politics of BVD eradication in the south around, and PI retention has been very dramatically resolved. But it's exactly the same in terms of TB, and that is that decisions made now, this decision point about how hard we push the system, will have implications for many years to come. Okay, in terms of the challenges, the first challenge in terms of wildlife, the key challenge I see for us in the Republic of Ireland moving forward is all about monitoring. The vaccine program has already been rolled out. It's been rolled out county by county, the counties that have been most successful in controlling TB. But into the future, the focus is really going to be on what's the R0, what's the reproductive ratio in badgers, and indeed in badgers in cattle in different areas of the country. So it will all be on monitoring progress. In terms of cattle, it's more challenging. The current focus in Ireland, and I suggest it's similar here, the current focus in Ireland is that we seek to make decisions on individuals. So we have a herd with a breakdown. It's our aim to say, well, these animals are infected and these ones are not. These ones can trade and these ones can't. And also there is tremendous pressure for a rapid return to trade, of course. But there's challenges, and these are the challenges as I see them. The first three are technical. The first one, with respect to the disease, there is residual infection. There are animals that will not test positive to current tests. Also, we know that herds that are infected will have a heightened risk of breaking down again for a period of time. Also, in technical speak, we're trying to maximise test sensitivity. What that means is we're trying to detect as many infected animals as possible. And lastly, these tests which are imperfect become even more imperfect under field conditions. And consistent interpretation is difficult. And also, there are additional challenges. As prevalence falls, we get lots more false positives, a higher percentage of false positives. And on the other side of the coin, from the farmer perspective, the commercial realities are extremely clear. Firstly, the aim to try and minimise the number of false positives, but that's completely at odds with trying to maximise test sensitivity. Very substantial animal movement. Biosecurity, which can be very high or very low depending on the farm. And this imperative, a commercial imperative, to release herds as soon as possible once you have 2 clear tests. But we can see, for example, from this graph, which looks at the percentage of herds that break down at the 6-month clearance test, 6 months later. In Ireland, and Northern Ireland's not hugely different, between 10 and 15% of herds will break down. And much of that is related to residual infection. Also, we know if we just look at the left-hand column here, 1 year after herds have been released, their risk, an odds ratio gives an estimate of risk. The risk for those herds is up to 4 times greater than a herd that never broke down. And that risk actually continues for up to 10 years. So these herds remain risky for up to 10 years. Or work from Cambridge has suggested, using 2 different models, but has suggested between 5 and 20% of herds at release from quarantine, 5 and 20% of those herds will still have infected animals. And they'll have between 1 and 4 or 5 infected animals. And just to show you, I have Australian perspectives, as you'd expect, but in the 64432 is the European rules in terms of TB. If we look at that in comparison with the Australian program, from the time of infection to the time that herds in Australia were free to trade with anyone was 8 years. Here it's 4 months. So there are fundamental differences, and in fact, taking it further, towards the end of the program, it was the view in Australia that herds remained risky until every single animal that was present during the last breakdown had gone. So you can see that there are big differences, but clearly there are commercial problems in that, and I'd like to suggest a way forward. The other thing is just to let you know that movement is a big issue. So if you look here, this is movement over 1 day, and if we look in an area of County Clare, this is movement over 1 day, this is movement over 1 year. Huge levels of movement that occur. So essentially what's happening is that we are recycling infection in the Republic, recycling infected animals, moving from herd to herd. I'll just jump forward because time is an issue. So the Australian approach, I think, is at this point in time relevant. I don't think it was relevant in the South until the transmission from wildlife was resolved. Risk in Australia was assessed at the herd level, never at the individual level. Risk-based classification was used. Risk-based trading was introduced, and infected herds, the controls on infected herds became more and more draconian as time went by. So basically herds moved progressively over that 8-year period from very high risk to very low risk, and during that period of time, for any given point in risk, they could introduce animals from herds of equivalent or lower risk, and they could sell to herds of equivalent or higher risk. And that was something that people found very difficult, perhaps at the beginning, but with time it became very straightforward. And the last point I'd like to make relates to program governance. The story in the South is that there is a fundamental difference between where we are and where we want to be. At the moment, TB is absolutely seen as a government problem. There is really no burning platform, no platform to change. There's a very well-worn narrative, particularly between the veterinary and the farming professions. There is a focus on the lowest common denominator, and there is a tremendous level of program fatigue. And that is fundamentally different from an animal health strategy that was released last year, where it's all about working in partnership, acknowledging roles and responsibilities, and reflecting costs and benefits. Just how much time do we have? Okay, thanks, Colin. The Australian experience, I think, is useful because eradication moved very rapidly in Australia until they got to an area of northern Australia known as the Kimberley, up in the north of Western Australia. And the key challenges there are very different to here. Most of the challenges related to the fact that they could not find all animals. They couldn't get a full muster. And so the authorities in Canberra suggested that what was needed was complete depopulation of farms. And the narrative at that time, this is back in 1984, is really very similar to the sentiments in the Irish Farmers' Journal at any week, really. For example, if you look at the last one, Tim Emanuel was an extremely influential pastoralist saying that we're the victims of bureaucracy gone mad. Or others would suggest that we really are in danger of the Canberra bureaucrats riding in and creating havoc. And so what happened was there was a fundamental change at that point in time so that farmers and farmer groups became fundamental to decision making and also fundamental to cost sharing. So what we have now at this point in time is really quite fundamental change in terms, for example, of cost sharing, where it's all been focused on the beneficiary pays, and there's legal documents in place, and it depends on what type of disease is involved. If it's rabies, government pays 100%. If it's African swine fever, which is currently sweeping across Europe from east to west, There's an agreement that 50% would be paid by government, 50% by industry. Or tuberculosis, which is now an exotic disease in Australia, that 20% would be paid by government and 20% by industry. I'll just jump forward in the interests of time and just come to my final point. There's lessons from Australia that I think are really important for the Republic at this point in time, now that we have a badger vaccine that is being rolled out, and now that we're able to drive the reproductive ratio below 1. And these are the fundamental lessons learnt. There has to be a compelling rationale for eradication, both nationally and, more importantly, for individual farmers. There has to be industry commitment and support, both in terms of decision-making but also funding. There needs to be a ruthless business model. There needs to be consistent and transparent technical standards. Abattoir surveillance becomes increasingly important towards the end of the program. There needs to be means to effectively eliminate residual infection, particularly with trade. And lastly, there needs to be very clear measures of progress. And my last slide comes from a photo taken in the year 2000. This was the last test on the last quarantined property in Queensland. There were 2 later cases in the Northern Territory, but I'm very sure that the Republic can get to this particular point as well. Thank you.